Today's rules are written in blood. Today we will look into the most terrifying pages of medical history. It's impossible to count the total number of people who died from bloodletting. They even let blood from healthy people. It was believed to be a way to prevent various diseases. The peak of absurdity came in the 18th and 19th centuries. The method of electroshock therapy was accepted by the medical community. No one could have imagined what kind of tragedy the world would have to face because of all this. Freeman penetrated the brain through the patient's eye socket. Once, Freeman drove the instrument too deep into the patient's brain, and the patient died. Chapter 1. Bloodletting. Bloodletting sounds terrible, but it was done by doctors in ancient times, and it's still done today. It was used in ancient India and ancient China, and bloodletting was part of rituals among African tribes and the indigenous peoples of America. According to some sources, this procedure was performed by the ancient Egyptians 2,000 years before Christ. This procedure was promoted by the father of medicine, Hippocrates. Yes, our oath, the Hippocratic Oath, and later Galen, who founded pharmacology. It was prescribed both for treatment and for prevention. And the lancet, which is a kind of instrument, the prototype of the scalpel, symbolized bloodletting and was one of the main attributes of the medical profession all the way up to the 19th century. One of the oldest and most respected medical journals, which is still published today, is named after it. And in our documentaries, we very often recall and cite studies from this wonderful journal as examples. The belief in bloodletting's benefits in Europe originated from Hippocrates' works. He was one of the first to document medical recommendations for this procedure. He described the so-called humoral theory, the theory of bodily fluids. If you've seen the recent film Frankenstein, it was described and mentioned there quite well. Hippocrates believed that a person's health depended on the balance of 4 fluids, which were called humors. These are blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and all diseases were considered to be caused by an imbalance of these vital fluids. By the way, the ratio of humors affected not only health, but even a person's character. Everyone knows about the 4 temperaments: sanguine, melancholic, choleric, and phlegmatic. Hippocrates linked these character traits specifically to the fluids in the body. The names of the temperaments come from the names of the fluids. Blood. In Latin, it's sanguis for blood, bile is chole, which is where the word choleric comes from, black bile is melancholy, and phlegm is phlegma. The humors were also associated with the 4 elements: fire, water, earth, and air, and even with the movement of celestial bodies. Of course, now this theory seems crazy, but before it, all diseases were simply considered punishment from the Almighty, from the gods. Of the 4 humors, the greatest attention was given to our red blood, its quality and quantity. Hippocrates believed that it was blood that balanced all 4 elements. A lack of blood was harmful, but an excess was considered even more dangerous. Bloodletting became a way to eliminate this excess, to remove the surplus from the body. People were treated with bloodletting. There was an extensive list of diseases. Let's recall colds, gas, gangrene, cough, stomach pains, and even cracks in the skull. From ancient Greece, bloodletting moved to the Roman Empire, where it was actively promoted by the physician and philosopher Galen. And the list of diagnoses for which bloodletting was used also expanded. Galen used it for fever, headaches, eye diseases, gout, and even dementia. Along with veins, arteries also began to be cut, by the way, since arterial bleeding was harder to stop. Patients often died from the treatment, not the disease. For example, bloodletting was used for gas, sometimes causing a terrible death. The doctors of the Middle Ages took up the baton, expanding even further the list of diseases treated with bloodletting, and they created an entire system showing where and how much blood needed to be let out to cure a patient. For each disease, there were specific protocols that described in detail where to make the incision, how often, and how much blood needed to be let out from a person. So, there were these medieval guidelines for bloodletting. The choice of location depended on which organ the disease was associated with, and bloodletting was performed even on healthy people. Well, it was believed to be a kind of prevention for various diseases. Excess blood was thought to be the cause of overheating. Supposedly, the temperature rises because of an increase in the fiery element. Can you imagine the list of diseases where a symptom could be a fever? So all these diseases, many of which hadn't even been discovered yet, were treated specifically with bloodletting. The peak of this absurdity came in the 18th and 19th centuries. During a single procedure, doctors could take up to 2 liters of blood from you. Can you imagine they often let blood until the patient fainted? The fainting, of course, happened because there wasn't enough blood volume in the body. Catholic priests, by the way, did things a bit differently. They let blood from parishioners, so to speak, to cleanse the spirit. So they weren't just treating the body, they were treating the soul. Bloodletting was done in barbershops. It was a routine procedure, just like shaving and haircuts. By the way, back then, barbers also pulled teeth. At the beginning of the 19th century, for example, the French doctor François Brousse advocated bloodletting as a cure-all for every disease. He put forward the theory that all diseases are the result of tissue inflammation, and the way to treat it, of course, is bloodletting. However, he abandoned the lancet and promoted what he considered a gentler method, safe for patients, in enormous quantities. They used, that's right, leeches, anywhere from 30 to 50 at a time during a single procedure. A leech typically draws 5 to 15 milliliters of blood, so you could lose up to 750 milliliters in one session, about a whole bottle of blood. Let me remind you, that's just one procedure, and how many of them Brousse prescribed only God knows, because he was making money off of it. His contemporaries called him a vampire. That's how obsessed he was with sucking blood from his patients. Patients often even died from blood loss. But thanks to Brousse, hirudotherapy became so fashionable that France ran out of leeches, and they had to be imported from other countries. At the beginning of 1832, France was swept by a cholera epidemic due to the population density. Paris suffered the most. The disease claimed the lives of about 20,000 Parisians, and in total, more than 100,000 French people fell victim to cholera. Brousse, as a doctor should, took an active part in saving the sick. The main symptoms of cholera, as you know, are severe diarrhea and vomiting. People died within a matter of hours from severe dehydration. Brousse treated cholera with a large number of leeches, which, as you can imagine, only worsened the dehydration and sped up the patient's deaths. After this epidemic, the authority of François Brousse as France's leading physician began to decline. Among the victims of bloodletting were very famous historical figures. For example, the English King Charles II. He had a seizure while shaving. Modern doctors suggest that it was a stroke. He was actively treated with laxatives and bloodletting, lost more than 700 milliliters of blood, and died. The English poet Lord Byron? He suffered from a severe cold, and after several sessions of our favorite and already well-known bloodletting, he lost almost 2 liters of blood and died. George Washington, the first president of the United States. We've seen him on banknotes. He rode a horse and caught a cold, and in just 2 days, doctors let out as much as 2.5 liters of blood from him. Just imagine that number, 2.5 liters. As a surgeon, I know and see what this is, and I know how hard it is for a patient to endure. An adult's body contains between 4 and 6 liters of blood, depending on their build. Naturally, the bigger you are, the more blood volume you have. There are 4 degrees of blood loss, and mild is about 10–15%. That's up to 1 liter. The symptoms of mild blood loss are weakness and dizziness. The moderate degree is already up to 30% blood loss. If we're talking about a large man, he can lose up to 1.5 liters of blood, and that would still be considered moderate. With this amount of blood loss, tachycardia develops. We also see this in the intensive care unit when we suspect bleeding, have no test results yet, and rely on indirect signs. Measuring the pulse can indicate possible bleeding, as well as symptoms like nausea and dizziness. And don't forget that bloodletting was not done on a healthy person, but on someone who came in with some kind of ailment. All of this can even lead to the development of shock, which is when blood pressure drops sharply, organs don't get enough oxygen, and consciousness becomes confused. In this condition, an urgent blood transfusion or transfusion of blood components is necessary. In severe cases, shock becomes inevitable, the function of very important organs is disrupted, and if no measures are taken, the person may die. And remember, for a child, the amount of blood loss that is considered acceptable and already approaches a fatal outcome is much lower. That's why surgeons especially hesitate and fear operating on children. The degree of blood loss calculated by body weight is much lower. Children tolerate blood loss very poorly. By the way, there is also a massive degree of blood loss, which we haven't mentioned yet. That's very scary. It's more than 40% of blood at this stage. A person falls into a coma. There's also a fatal degree. I think the consequences here are obvious. Moreover, the shorter the period of time in which you lose blood, the higher the chances of a fatal outcome. That's exactly why, when bleeding occurs during surgery, we're at especially high risk because we can lose blood very quickly. As you understand, leeches do this a bit more slowly. It's probably not customary to thank sponsors, but the sponsor of all my useful videos is one company, that's Ipsum. My own company films my videos for me and pays for all of this. And I believe that we're doing quite a big and useful thing. We share useful knowledge with ordinary people. We help you avoid mistakes. We help you become a little better, a little healthier. Thank you for trusting my vitamins. I'll put their link below this video. Thank you, Ipsum, for helping to do good deeds and for helping me continue to run such useful segments on my channel, not only on YouTube, but on all other social networks as well. Don't worry, it's impossible to calculate the total number of people who have died from being drowned. But despite the fact that this treatment method was very popular, medicine is with you even now in this video. And today it is developing, and back then it was developing slowly, but still developing nonetheless. Glad you'll see the videos that will come. Who doubted that this brings any benefit at all? Until next time, bye for now. Illness is not a disruption of the internal fluid balance, but the result of some external influence, and bloodletting, on the contrary, deprives the body of vital strength. His theory had followers, for example, the Flemish doctor Jan Baptista van Helmont. He also considered bloodletting a pointless procedure. To prove this, he proposed an experiment to take several hundred patients, poor people, and divide them into two groups. He planned to treat one group without bloodletting, while the second group would be treated by supporters of the usual bloody methods. The experiment was supposed to finally settle the matter by counting the number of deaths in each group, but no one volunteered, and the experiment never took place. The experiment was eventually carried out by the French doctor Pierre-Charles Alexandre Louis, a contemporary of François Broussais, whom I mentioned earlier. He was an active opponent of bloodletting. By the way, I would probably have done the same and defended my position just as aggressively as I often do today, and I stand and applaud colleagues like that. Louis had the courage to analyze the medical histories of patients with pneumonia. He compared two groups, those who had bloodletting in the first 4 days of illness and those who did it later. And the result of the study showed that in the group who underwent bloodletting at the peak of the illness, when the body needed the most resources, what do you think? Deaths occurred almost twice as often as among those who were already recovering and had their bloodlet. The conclusion is obvious, and Louis came to the same conclusion. Bloodletting for pneumonia is not only ineffective, but also dangerous. And Broussais' method. Patience. This study became a turning point in the history of medicine, marking the transition from speculative theories to evidence-based medicine. Thus, Pierre-Charles Louis laid the foundation for epidemiological research and modern clinical trials. Chapter 2: Mercurialism. This thermometer contains about 2 grams of mercury. If I break it now, of course, we'll even have to stop filming and quickly clean everything up, maybe even call emergency services. Why? Because mercury vapor is very toxic. The mercury itself, I can safely play with it in my hand, but its vapor is dangerous when inhaled. It causes acute poisoning and affects the central nervous system. My kidneys can be affected, my liver too, and all of this can lead to long-term health consequences. But for thousands of years, mercury was called, what do you think, liquid silver or silver water. You see, people had a very positive attitude toward it. People believed that mercury could cure any disease, grant longevity, or even immortality. The most prominent victim of this belief was Qin Shi Huangdi, the first Chinese emperor who lived in the 3rd century before Christ. He was obsessed with the idea of immortality and regularly took mercury potions. But instead of eternal life, as you might have guessed, he suffered severe poisoning and died before even reaching the age of 50. His tomb is guarded not only by 8,000 terracotta warriors, by the way they will soon be coming to Moscow, but also by mercury vapors, since the soil around his grave is still contaminated. The doctor and alchemist Paracelsus, the founder of pharmacology, was also obsessed with the search for the elixir of immortality and became an active promoter of mercury therapy. He recommended ointments, pills, and even inhalation of its poisonous vapors. Paracelsus's fascination with mercury led to sad consequences. He died at the age of 48, having inhaled the fumes of the dangerous metal, leaving behind 6 recipes for elixirs of eternal life based on mercury. By the way, if you remember the movie The Mummy with Tom Cruise, the tomb of that evil creature was guarded by mercury. Some people believed that mercury fought off evil spirits. By the way, almost everything was tried to be treated with mercury. Mercury chloride, or calomel, was especially popular. According to the humoral theory I told you about, calomel was supposed to remove excess bile and cleanse the body. It was prescribed as a laxative and antiemetic for yellow fever and mental disorders, and even for teething in infants. Can you imagine? Today this seems wild again, but just think about how much wild stuff might be happening in medicine today, and someday people will laugh at us too. But one of the most absurd and tragic chapters in the history of medicine was the centuries-long fight against syphilis using mercury. It was perfectly described by the creepy saying, "One night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury." Recently, a movie called Frankenstein was released. I'm coming back to cinema a lot today, and there, one of the main characters, his body was affected by syphilis, and he was treated with mercury. He had a vial of mercury hidden in his cane, which he used all the time. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it. It's a great movie. Mercury is called mercury in English, a liquid metal linked to the god Mercury. Why is that? Because of the rapid movement of its droplets. The first major syphilis epidemic in Europe broke out in Naples. When the troops of the French King Karl VIII arrived in the city, the soldiers visited local brothels, which became the epicenters of the epidemic. The disease began to be treated with mercury chloride. Patients were poisoned by mercury-based drugs for years, sometimes even decades, suffering from horrific symptoms of poisoning. Among them were uncontrollable drooling, tooth loss, and damage to the kidneys and nervous system. Watch Frankenstein again. It clearly shows what a person with syphilis looks like. And in fact, the external manifestations of his illness were largely related to how he treated this disease. If I recall, he was bald under his wig, his skin was peeling, and he wasn't feeling well. Doctors actually took all these painful symptoms as signs of the body cleansing itself from the disease, or even as symptoms of syphilis itself. Many people died not from the infection but from the treatment, despite the side effects. Over the years, people's belief in the miraculous properties of mercury only grew stronger. By the way, our Ivan Grozny became a victim of mercury treatment. Remember, he suffered from fits of uncontrollable rage. Some scientists believe that this was not a personality trait which caused so many people to suffer, but Mercurialism, or simply chronic mercury poisoning.
It is worth noting that Mercurialism manifests itself as mental agitation, anxiety, fearfulness, and suspiciousness. Noticeable changes in the Tsar's personality, resembling a mental disorder, began to occur starting in 1553. For several months, he was in a state that psychiatrists refer to as depressive delusional syndrome. He couldn't find peace, saw enemies everywhere, lost a lot of weight, and almost all the hair on his head fell out.
What could have happened? In 1553, after the campaign against Kazan, Grozny fell seriously ill with a fever, and the Tsar was treated with liquid silver. But you know what I mean, right? Of course, I'm talking about mercury. Most likely, this kind of treatment explains Grozny's suddenly deteriorating character. An overdose of mercury can cause epileptic seizures and mental agitation. Some historians believe that the Tsar suffered from syphilis, which in Russia was called the French disease. By the way, it is chronic syphilis that can lead to the formation of osteophytes. These are growths on the bones, like salt deposits on the spine, for example, which cause severe pain when moving. They were actually discovered, by the way, when his remains were studied. In addition, the Tsar suffered from cirrhosis of the liver, another consequence of syphilis. In 1963, scientists performed an autopsy on the royal tomb in the Archangel Cathedral of the Kremlin. The analysis showed that the mercury content in the monarch's bones was 32 times higher than normal.
Chapter 3. Insulin coma therapy.
But not all medicines from the past are poisonous or dangerous, for example, insulin. 100 years ago, a diagnosis of diabetes in a child sounded like a death sentence. It was sometimes called the sugar disease. Most often, the child had no more than a year to live. Everything changed thanks to a young orthopedist, Frederick Barting, who was able to extract pure insulin from a dog's pancreas. At that time, scientists understood that diabetes occurs because the pancreas does not produce enough insulin. The first person to receive the life-saving injection was 14-year-old Leonard Thompson. He was hopelessly ill and in a diabetic coma. In January 1922, the boy received his first injection and his glucose level dropped by 25%. However, inflammation appeared at the injection site. Then Banting involved his colleague James Cullip in the work, and he managed to purify the insulin. The boy was given another injection, and this time the effect was stunning. The glucose level dropped by 77%. The very next year, for his discovery, Frederick Banting received, as you might guess, the Nobel Prize and became the youngest laureate in the history of the award. Banting sold his discovery's patent to the University of Toronto for $1 to make the medicine accessible to millions. Now that's truly a person with a big and generous heart.
Insulin does not belong to me, it belongs to the world.
How does insulin work? It helps glucose enter the cell, and if there isn't enough of it, no matter how much a person eats, their cells won't get glucose. That's why people with diabetes who don't receive timely treatment are so thin and emaciated. The nutrients don't get into the cells, and there's very little energy. And the level of glucose, this harmful crystalloid in the blood, goes off the charts, and it damages our tissues. The introduction of insulin puts everything in its place. It's like a key that unlocks the cell and lets glucose in. But as Paracelsus said, the dose makes the poison. It's a pity, of course, but he didn't heed his own saying when he was fascinated with mercury, but that's not the point right now. Insulin was a salvation and a miracle for many at that time, until one doctor started abusing its use. In 1933, psychiatrist Manfred Zackel came up with the method of insulin coma therapy. Initially, he used insulin to help patients with morphine and heroin addiction. According to his observations, the hormone eased withdrawal symptoms and improved a person's appetite. However, Zackel noticed an unexpected effect. When severe hypoglycemia developed, some patients temporarily experienced a reduction in psychotic symptoms, such as delusions and, for example, hallucinations. So, he came up with the idea: what if patients with schizophrenia were put into a hypoglycemic coma for therapeutic purposes? Zackel presented a report on the new treatment method at a meeting of the Vienna Medical Society. The report was received with great enthusiasm, and the press at the time actively wrote about it as a real breakthrough in the treatment of mental disorders. This is how medical publications of that era described this innovation.
About half an hour later, the patient becomes restless, tosses and turns, first moans and then screams, and a state of extreme agitation may develop. He jumps out of bed, stares intently and shouts loudly. He rushes about frantically and looks like a person manically resisting intense fear. Foam comes out of his mouth, his pupils dilate, and he may desperately bang his head, arms and legs. A coma sets in, and the patient lies curled up in bed in a deep faint with a weakened pulse. The patient does not recover.
A terrifying picture, isn't it? Now imagine that, on average, a course consisted of 30 comas, and in some cases, patients were put into a coma 60 or even 70 times. Think about these numbers. Why did this barbaric method remain in medical practice for another 20 years? The answer is simple. In 2 years, Zackel published more than 13 articles about the benefits of his method and included his research. He claimed that 88 and included his findings. Percent of patients showed significant improvement after a course of insulin comas, and according to his data, 70% of patients fully recovered. News of the Austrian doctor's triumph quickly spread around the world. Zackel became the darling of the psychiatric community and was counting no less on the Nobel Prize. Doctors in Europe and the United States enthusiastically rushed to master his breakthrough method. But the more popular Zackel's method became, the more often doctors noticed dangerous consequences for health and life. Patients began to experience irreversible changes in the brain, and sometimes it even led to death. Some doctors considered the pathological changes in personality to be a good sign, since the patient's aggression disappeared, hostility went away, and even the inner tension subsided. Yes, but everything changed. One publication in the medical journal The Lancet. Psychiatrist Harold Bourne wrote an article called The Myth of Insulin, and in this article he finally debunked Zackel's method.
Insulin does not provide any long-term benefit to a person with schizophrenia. At best, it speeds up the improvement that would have happened anyway with regular patient care in the hospital.
The article caused a stir, there was an uproar, a flood of accusations, and psychiatrists began sending angry letters with criticism to the relevant journal. It took another 5 years before a thorough review of insulin and coma therapy showed beyond any doubt that this method, it was simply quackery, and on the contrary, another method, which I still consider barbaric, actually turned out to be truly effective. I will tell you about it with interest now. I have a Telegram channel, it's free, there are no subscriptions or anything like that, and I don't post any ads there. Once every few days, sometimes every other day, I try to post useful content there about health, habits, and how to become the best version of yourself. I do all of this myself. I don't have any copywriters, and I do it with one goal, to help you become healthier. I'll leave the link to my Telegram channel below this video. Subscribe and benefit from it. Share it with your friends. Thank you.
Chapter 4. Electroconvulsive Therapy.
The idea of treating mental disorders with seizures belongs to the Hungarian neurologist Laszlo Meduna. While working at a psychiatric clinic, he noticed that patients who experienced seizures showed temporary but still noticeable improvement. Patients' delusions and hallucinations would subside and their speech would become coherent. So, Meduna decided to use seizures, which had previously been just a side effect of powerful medications, as a form of treatment. In 1934, he began clinical trials. He injected patients with large doses of cardiazol, which is a central nervous system stimulant. After the injection, seizures would start almost instantly. The results were astonishing. Patients regained consciousness, began to take care of themselves, and some started speaking for the first time in years of therapy. This sparked a wave of optimism, and the medical community began to wonder if a cure had finally been found for a previously incurable disease. News of Meduna's work reached Rome. The dean of the Faculty of Mental and Nervous Diseases at Sapienza University of Rome, Ugo Cerletti, was skeptical about the work of his Hungarian colleague. The electric method seemed to him cheaper, more accessible, and most importantly, controllable. Together with his student Lucio Bini, he developed a special device. This device was called the Cerletti-Bini apparatus. It was a device that allowed for voltage regulation and was equipped with an automatic stopwatch. Despite the positive results, the procedure itself was an extremely difficult ordeal. The patient's body was instantly seized by a powerful convulsion. All the muscles contracted, patients arched their bodies, air burst from their lungs with a wheeze, and their limbs thrashed in convulsions. Due to the extremely strong muscle tension, there was involuntary emptying of the bowels and bladder. The strain was so intense that even microfractures in the bones could occur. It was a terrifying sight. One troubling consequence was memory loss. Some patients did not recognize those around them and sometimes even forgot their closest relatives. In most cases, memory gradually returned, but for some patients, the gaps remained irreparable. Despite all this, the method of electroshock therapy was accepted by the medical community as a harsh but effective measure. Here's what contemporaries of this procedure had to say about it.
A surgeon does not refuse a necessary operation just because it is risky. Mental disorders are just as destructive as a malignant tumor and bring even more terrible suffering. Therefore, the risk is justified.
The methods were considered controversial. He was further discredited by the fact that doctors in Nazi Germany took an interest in him. In 1944, Austrian doctor and Nazi Party member Emil Gelny turned the device into a weapon. He added 4 more electrodes, increased the duration of the charge to several minutes, and used the current on 149 patients. As part of so-called racial hygiene, the Nazis used electroshock not only in psychiatric hospitals but also in concentration camps, including in Svincem. They tried to revive emaciated prisoners to force them to continue working, or simply those who were weak. But even in the post-war years, the therapy was often used indiscriminately, going far beyond its original indications. Electroshock was used in attempts to treat all psychiatric problems, and even homosexuality was tried to be treated with psychiatric electric currents. In hospitals, this procedure was often used without indications to control troublesome patients. As I mentioned earlier, the side effects of the procedure were amnesia and confusion. Patients became compliant and quiet, which made it easier to care for them in overcrowded medical facilities. These abuses discredited the method for many years and hindered scientific research into its effectiveness and safety, and the therapy itself became a kind of symbol of punitive psychiatry. Just remember the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest starring Jack Nicholson, where a mentally healthy person who ended up in an asylum is driven insane with the help of electroshock therapy and lobotomy. The film very realistically shows how electroshock therapy was performed. Let's watch a clip from this remarkable movie. It's a frightening scene, isn't it? But there's one significant inaccuracy in it. The fact is, by the 1940s, electroshock therapy was already being performed with anesthesia, and medications were also used to relax the muscles. The patient simply slept during the procedure and didn't experience the physical discomfort that Jack Nicholson portrayed so well, but still acted out. Today, electroconvulsive therapy is recognized as an effective method for treating severe forms of depression and other illnesses. It works even when other treatments are powerless. Specialists from the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Canada found that electroconvulsive therapy reduces the risk of SAPTI among patients with depression by as much as 50%. The scientists conducted voluntary electroconvulsive therapy sessions for 6,000 patients who had depression. And over the course of a year, the number of SAPTI among patients who underwent the therapy was 50% lower than among those treated by other methods. Mortality from other causes fell by nearly 25% over the year. After discharge, researchers from Aberdeen University in Scotland figured out how the mechanism of such treatment works. The electric impulse, if you can put it that way, performs a kind of reboot of the brain, specifically of the processes responsible for mood, stress, and thinking. During the procedure, there is a release of key neurotransmitters, serotonin, noradrenaline, dopamine, and gamma-aminobutyric acid. Also, during depression, there is a pathological, abnormal activity of neurons between different areas of the brain responsible for negative emotions and decision-making. To put it simply, negative emotions start to influence a person's decisions. Therapy relaxes this obsessive hyperactivity and allows the neurons, these connections, to reorganize in a healthier way. In addition, the electrical impulse helps restore connections in the brain and even helps new cells grow. It is precisely because of this effect that the brain gets the opportunity to form new, more adaptive pathways for regulating emotions. This explains the stable and increasing results after a full course of procedures. But despite the research and the obvious benefits of electroconvulsive therapy for some patients, this procedure is still met with hostility by many and is considered barbaric. Let's be honest, write in the comments how you felt about electroshock therapy before this historical background I just gave you. What do you think? Should a dark past hinder progress? Write your thoughts in the comments. One of the most terrifying chapters in the history of medicine began with an unfortunate accident that happened to an ordinary worker, Phineas Gage. In 1848, he was a railroad construction worker. During blasting operations, the dynamite accidentally detonated, and the crowbar that Gage was using pierced straight through his head. Amazingly, he survived and even continued to live a normal life, despite losing 11% of his brain. His personality, of course, changed a lot. He became aggressive, bored, prone to depression, impulsive, moody, and foolish. This case became the first strong evidence that the frontal lobes of the brain are responsible for social behavior, decision-making, and the formation of personality. Exactly 40 years after Gage's accident, Gottlieb Burckhardt, a psychiatrist and chief physician of a small psychiatric hospital in Switzerland, performed the first lobotomy in history. There wasn't even such a term yet, but Burckhardt, without even having surgical training, removed part of the brain from 6 patients using a sharp spoon. As a result, according to the scientist's own records, one of the patients died 5 days later from a severe epileptic seizure. Another patient got better, but after some time committed suicide. The operation had no effect on the behavior of 2 others, and the remaining 2 became quieter. The medical community considered Burckhardt's methods harsh and inhumane, and he stopped performing such operations. It might seem that the history of lobotomy could have ended there, but it didn't. Another 40 years later, physiologist John Fulton was able to create and lead the first primate neurophysiology laboratory at Yale University in the United States. His scientific pursuits led to the invention of lobotomy. Fulton's first test subjects were chimpanzees Lucy and Becky, who had part of their frontal lobe removed. After the surgery, the animals lost the ability to perform certain tasks, but they became calmer. In 1935, John Fulton presented a report on this discovery at the International Neurological Congress in London. There he talked about how the aggressive and neurotic chimpanzee Becky became calm and obedient after his prefrontal brain areas were destroyed. The Portuguese neurologist Antonio Igos Monish was present at that Congress. He was so inspired by Fulton's report that, together with neurosurgeon Almeida Lima, he developed an entire procedure of prefrontal leucotomy for treating patients with depression. They also treated anxiety and aggressive behavior with this method. The scientists were convinced that some mental disorders were related to disrupted connections between the frontal lobe and other parts of the brain, and that surgical intervention, removal of the brain's white matter, could improve the condition of such patients. This is how Moniz and Lima became the founders of psychosurgery. Let's take a closer look at the brain to understand what Moniz and Lima were trying to achieve. Look, the brain consists of 2 hemispheres. They are covered by the cortex, which is gray matter. Inside, there are conducting pathways and nuclei, which are white matter. The goal of the operation was to sever the connections between the frontal lobes and the rest of the brain, primarily with the thalamus. Scientists assumed that this would reduce emotional reactivity and the number of psychotic or obsessive discharges. Moniz and Lima performed leucotomy on 20 patients with anxiety disorders, including those with depressive disorders and schizophrenia. In March 1936, they shared the first results of their work. A third of the patients fully recovered, another third showed improvement, and the rest showed no changes. Side effects were recorded after this operation, including fever, vomiting, urinary incontinence, diarrhea, obsessive-compulsive disorder, apathy, and disorientation. After that, lobotomy gained popularity, especially in the United States. The main American promoters of lobotomy were neurologist Walter Freeman and surgeon James Watson, and the first lobotomy was performed by them just 6 months after the report by Moniz and Lima in September 1936. The first patient was a housewife from Kansas who suffered from an anxiety disorder and was frequently admitted to psychiatric hospitals due to constant panic attacks. After the operation, the woman suffered for several months from muscle spasms, difficulties in communication, and disorientation. However, the panic attacks did not return, and she said that she was happy. Freeman considered the result a success. Later, he called this procedure a lobotomy. Over the next 6 years, Freeman would perform about 200 more operations. In Freeman's opinion, most of them were positive. Success was measured either by the recovery of the patients or by their calming down, when especially unruly ones became quiet and submissive. A quarter of the patients showed no changes, but 14% of the operations led to serious consequences. The patients became disabled or even died. The most famous victim of Freeman was the younger sister of the 35th President of the United States, John Kennedy, Rose Marie. Even as a little girl, she developed more slowly than her peers, and as she grew older, her delay became more and more obvious. Today, she would be called a special child, but back then, developmental differences were stigmatized. By the age of 15, she could read and write at a 4th grade level, but that didn't stop her from living an active life. She loved shopping, dancing, swimming, sailing, and spending time with friends. Overall, Rosa Marie was a sociable person and in general functioned normally in society. Her mother, Rose, described her daughter as affectionate, responsive, and loving. But by the age of 22, she had become aggressive and irritable, started dating men, and going to bars. This behavior was absolutely unacceptable to her father, Joseph Kennedy. The family was expected to have a bright political future, so, concerned about his reputation, he secretly had his daughter lobotomized without her mother knowing. Despite the fact that by that time the procedure already had a bad reputation, in November of '61, Freeman still performed the operation on the girl, from which she never recovered. As anesthesia, she took a mild tranquilizer, so she was conscious during this ordeal. Freeman asked the girl to recite prayers and sing "God Bless America." That was how he determined how deep to insert the instrument. At first, Rosemary's speech became slurred, then she fell silent forever. The girl was left disabled for the rest of her life. She was hidden from the public eye in an institution for people with disabilities in Wisconsin. The Kennedy family kept information about Rosemary's condition strictly secret out of fear for their reputation. For decades, the Kennedys hid the fact that their daughter had undergone a lobotomy and had been left disabled. Even within the family, Rosemary was rarely spoken about, and not all relatives knew where she was or what had happened to her. 20 years later, Joseph Kennedy wrote a letter of gratitude to the institution where his daughter lived.
Your help solving the problem with Rosemary was crucial for the family. Because of this, the Kennedys could continue their life's work.
Despite this tragedy and many others, the story of lobotomy did not end. Freeman continued to perform operations, and in 1948 he even invented a more effective method, the transorbital lobotomy. It is said that for the first such operation, Freeman used an ordinary ice pick, almost like this one. What was the core innovation? Freeman accessed the brain through the eye socket, eliminating the need to drill into the skull, and the procedure took just 20 minutes. From that moment on, lobotomy began to be prescribed more often. It was used not only to treat mental disorders, but also gastrointestinal bleeding, peptic ulcers, severe headaches, and ulcerative colitis. In 1949, Igor Shmonish received the Nobel Prize for discovering the therapeutic effect of leucotomy in certain mental disorders. The Nobel Prize became the best advertisement, and over the next 3 years, at least 50,000 operations were performed in the United States. Freeman personally treated about 3,500 patients, including 19 children, the youngest of whom was only 4 years old. In 1952, Freeman equipped the so-called Lobotomobile, not to be confused with the Batmobile, in which he traveled around the country and performed operations for anyone who wanted them for just $25. His obsession and sense of permissiveness reached its peak. He boasted that he was ambidextrous and could operate equally well with both his left and right hand, and he demonstrated this by performing simultaneous lobotomies on 2 patients at once. One day, Freeman was being photographed during an operation and pushed the instrument too deep into the patient's brain, causing the patient to die during the photo shoot. But fatal outcomes did not bother the unfortunate doctor, nor did the fact that he had no surgical training. It was only in 1967 that he was banned from performing surgeries after his patient died following her 3rd lobotomy. 5 years later, he died, leaving behind thousands of ruined lives. One of the children he operated on would later write a memoir that vividly revealed Freeman's obsession.
Trying to learn more about what a person experiences during a lobotomy, Freeman decided to perform operations on patients who were awake using only local anesthesia. During one of these procedures, Freeman asked the patient, "What do you feel?" "A knife," the patient replied. Freeman told this story for many years, clearly enjoying it.
By the way, lobotomy was also practiced in the Soviet Union, but in this case, we were luckier, if you can say so. We didn't follow the West. Instead, we studied the procedure using scientific methods. In total, about 400 lobotomies were performed in the Soviet Union, which is very hard to compare considering there were tens of thousands in the West. In 1950, an order was issued banning lobotomy. The Ministry of Health of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics called this procedure contrary to the principles of humanity, and I personally agree with that. Gradually, this brutal procedure was abolished in other countries as well, but in the United States, a law banning lobotomy was only developed in 1979. Hello, friends? I want to remind you that I have Ipsum vitamins, which I created with love, first and foremost for my family, for my friends, and now for my child. Because very soon, maybe by the time this video is out, there will also be a children's line and sports nutrition, which I also plan to make. I try to choose the best raw materials, use the best production technologies, and at my own factory, which is located in a special economic zone in Dubna. I make vitamins for you that I am proud of and for which I stand by my reputation. That's why my last name and signature are on every bottle. Friends, thank you for your trust. Thank you for the tens of thousands of positive reviews, for the ratings you give our vitamins, and for believing and trusting in us. The most important thing, the greatest value in my life is your health. Be happy. The link to the vitamins is below this video.
Chapter 6: The Thalidomide Tragedy.
The next story begins in Nazi Germany, right after the war. German entrepreneur and former Nazi Hermann Wirtz founded the pharmaceutical company Chemie Grünenthal. The choice of staff was obvious. The team was led by a young doctor, Heinrich Mückter, who had conducted experiments on prisoners in labor camps in Poland. Otto Ambros was one of the creators of sarin. This is a nerve agent that the Nazis used as a chemical weapon. And Martin Stemmler was one of the most zealous followers, an investigator of the ideas of racial hygiene and eugenics in the Third Reich. According to Wirtz's plan, this trio was supposed to be like the horsemen of the apocalypse. They were supposed to work on producing cheap antibiotics, but the idea failed. Instead, they synthesized thalidomide. Initially, the scientists believed they had created an anticonvulsant, but studies showed that thalidomide did not have anticonvulsant properties. However, it did have a pronounced sedative effect. Experiments on mice showed that the drug had no side effects. The mice could consume a huge amount of the medicine and still did not die. So, the scientists concluded that the drug was safe and could even be given to pregnant women. Just 2 years later, thalidomide appeared in pharmacies and was marketed as a miracle drug. It was prescribed for almost every illness, from insomnia, headaches, cough, nausea, even for the common cold. Later, it was included in other medications for asthma, high blood pressure, and many others. It was produced in countries across Europe, Asia, Africa, and South America. People in 45 countries took these miracle pills, and of course, no additional research was conducted. One fateful day, an enthusiastic letter from a doctor arrived at Chemie Grünenthal's office, stating that thalidomide was the best remedy for pregnant women because it suppressed morning sickness, reduced irritability, and improved sleep. The British drug distributor immediately used this as a marketing ploy, and sales among pregnant women skyrocketed. No one could have imagined the tragedy the world would have to face because of all this. In the spring of 1961, at a maternity hospital in Sydney, Australian obstetrician William McBride delivered a baby with deformed arms and internal organ problems. A few weeks later, the doctor had 2 more newborn patients with similar abnormalities in his care.
Recently, I noticed that the frequency of multiple severe abnormalities in children born to women who took thalidomide during pregnancy is almost 20%.
The doctor noted that bone development is affected, resulting in newborns being diagnosed with polydactyly, extra fingers, and syndactyly, fused fingers. This is observed due to underdevelopment of the limb. This is how McBride describes it. Several similar cases were also described by the German pediatrician and geneticist Wedukind Lenz. He was the one who proved the connection between thalidomide and children with congenital defects. During his independent research, he discovered 2 facts. The first fact: out of 212,000 children born in Hamburg before the widespread use of thalidomide, only 1 was born with a limb development anomaly. The second fact: 50% of the mothers of affected children reported taking thalidomide during the first trimester of pregnancy. The connection was obvious, and in November 1961, thalidomide was banned. Only then did scientists begin a thorough investigation of the drug. It turned out that the thalidomide molecule can exist in 2 mirror image forms, and it is impossible to predict which of these forms the molecule will take. This property is called chirality. In one form, thalidomide has a sedative effect, and in the other, it is teratogenic. In simple terms, it causes abnormal embryonic development. Moreover, just 1 tablet was enough to sharply increase the risk of abnormal development in a child. Unfortunately, the developmental disorders in children were varied. Some were born without limbs, sometimes without ear auricles. Children could be born with eye defects or without functioning facial muscles. Thalidomide damaged the heart, liver, kidneys, and the child's digestive and urinary systems. Sometimes it led to the birth of children with intellectual disabilities. There could be epilepsy, and by the way, autism was also sometimes observed. According to various estimates, between 8,000 and 12,000 children were affected by thalidomide. Almost half of the infants did not live to see their first birthday. The number of miscarriages also increased sharply. After the drug was withdrawn in 1961, Hemi Grunenthal began to drown in lawsuits. There was so much material in the lawsuits that the trial began only 7 years later. Journalists called the trial the Second Nuremberg. It lasted for 2 years. During this time, 120 witnesses testified, 60 experts were heard, and more than 2,000 documents were admitted. Up to 40 lawyers defended the pharmaceutical company's interests. And despite all the efforts and accusations and all the evidence collected, in 1970, the defendants left the courtroom as free men with all charges dropped against them. The German government, together with Hemi Grunenthal, developed a compensation scheme for the families of the victims. The pharmaceutical company committed to creating a fund from which payments would be made to them over many years. However, the payments did not start right away, and they were small and irregular. Thousands of affected German families with ruined children's lives were forced to accept this compensation. Only after 45 years did British journalists manage to find evidence in the archives of the German government's interference in this court case. They found out that 6 months before the trial ended, representatives of Hemi Grunenthal met with the German Minister of Health and then with 4 more ministers. After these behind-the-scenes meetings, the criminal case was closed. Supposedly, there was never really an intention to convict anyone, and the purpose of the trial was to change the system of production and distribution of pharmaceutical drugs. And apparently, there were no people responsible for the deaths of thousands of children. In this utter darkness of injustice and corruption, there was still a ray of light. One fragile woman managed to prevent the thalidomide tragedy from spreading in the United States. Yes, this drug did appear in the States, but as a tranquilizer, it could only be obtained by prescription. It was not available for mass consumption. Pharmacologist Frances Kelsey worked at the Food and Drug Administration. In 1961, she refused to grant a license to thalidomide, even though the drug was widely used in other countries. It was supposed to be a simple review of a sleeping pill that was already widely used in Europe and Canada. The manufacturer was not expecting any problems getting the drug onto the United States market, but Kelsey was troubled by the lack of adequate research data. Even though the drug was recommended for pregnant women, no studies had been conducted on pregnant animals, and overall, the attached safety documents seemed more like a glowing review than real evidence. Kelsey rejected the application and demanded more thorough testing, but instead of additional clinical trials, pressure was put on Kelsey. Instead of new research, she kept receiving new applications for the drug's approval, and time after time, she rejected them. Until news reached the United States about the negative effects of thalidomide on human fetal development, and access to the drug on the American market was finally closed. In 1962, for her perseverance, Frances Kelsey was awarded the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service, which was personally presented to her by United States President John Kennedy.
Her exceptional approach in evaluating the safety of the new drug prevented a huge tragedy of birth defects in the United States. Thanks to her high abilities and unwavering confidence in her professional decision, she made an outstanding contribution to the protection of the American people.
Today, especially, for example, when it comes to peptides, new peptides appear every day. They are not adequately studied, we know nothing about them, but we calmly buy them on various websites where it will be written that they are simply not for use in humans. And on the recommendation of a coach, friend, neighbor, or sometimes even a doctor, we calmly start using them, blindly trusting. And we don't realize that the consequences may catch up with us in 2, 3, or even 10 years. So remember this video, share it with your friends and acquaintances. This is good evidence and an example of how sometimes even people in white coats make big retrograde mistakes that create giant graveyards, let alone people without a medical education. Don't forget that today's rules are written in blood, and unfortunately, medicine is the most inexact science. And perhaps a lot of what even doctors advise and tell you today is just the same. One day, 50, 60, or even 100 years from now, people will look back and remember these things with a smile or with fear, mentioning them in some other documentary version of the horrors of the past, of medicine. All the best to you.